you have your Bibles, you want to turn back to the passage that John read first from Exodus chapter 20. We'll look at the fourth commandment. Do you have time for God? The third commandment's the one that we're most conscious and maybe other people breaking. Sorry, I'll put the microphone on. The fourth commandment's one that as Christians we might be least conscious of breaking ourselves or struggle with keeping. It's the longest of the 10 commandments, and it begins with the words, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. That word remember. I have difficulties sometimes remembering things. And I suspect there's a few of us here have those moments when we forget things we should do. God knows and understands. And getting that right is something that can be a challenge, so God asks us to remember. Now, it's not always easy to do this. Some people can react against legalistic lists of prohibitions from a former era, where to ask, can I, required the answer, not on the Sabbath. Some of us who are a bit older remember stricter upbringings than is currently the case today. Yet Psalm 118 verse 24 says, this is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. But we maybe not always felt that way. American writer Mark Twain, in his satirical work, Extracts from Adam's Diary, translated from the original manuscript, wrote in the early part of the book, Sunday, pulled through. This day is getting to be more and more trying. Later in the book, using the character of Adam, he writes, I've come to like Sundays myself. Superintending tires the body so. There ought to be more Sundays. In the olden days, they were tough. Now they come in handy. It's interesting. This year, 2 people I know who live in our community who are not Christians, who never think of going to church, have mentioned how much they value Sunday being different. It's really interesting hearing someone who's not a professing Christian justifying why Sunday should be different. But it's the arguments about the balance of being able to do things with people who are special comes to the heart of that. But it's been harder the last 30 years in our country to separate the days because of things blurring from one day to another, with people having different work patterns. With technology, you can be contacted at whatever place you're located. And it's hard to keep it distinctive. Of course, the lines of work, the medical profession, the caring profession, and some others that have to work, and we've always been strongly in favour of that as Christians. So what does this commandment mean, and how can we live it? So what is it, the Sabbath? It's a foundation for society. The word is the idea of rest, to cease from regular activities, to take a break. God modelled that in creation. Genesis 2. It says, by the seventh day God had finished the work that he'd been doing. On the seventh day he rested from all his work. He blessed the seventh day and made it holy. God wasn't saying that he needed a break, that he was exhausted. He was saying, I am giving you a pattern for life to be sustainable. Life gets tough and you get tired with the demands upon you. And maybe some of you had one of those weeks where just getting through it, you're exhausted and you just long for the weekend to get a bit of a break. God knows we need rest. And God's saying, to get through your whole life, you need to have a pattern that's sustainable, that's durable, that will last. Work's important, whether it's remunerated or not financially. We have to have some purpose to our lives. But rest, time for worship, time for family and so on is really important. But it can be hard getting a pattern of knowing how to live that way. Interestingly, during the desert wanderings with the feeding of the people with the manna, God made that available 6 days, not 7 days a week, suggesting to them they sorted out their food gathering on the 6 days of the week and had a day's break. The giving of this commandment was not just in the 10 Commandments when the Israelite nation began. It was a creation ordinance. So it's not just for the people of God. God's saying all of his creation needs Sabbath, needs rest, needs this pattern for life. That's why the Bible speaks of the wider use of the Sabbath principle. There's the 1 day a week, which was foundational in creation, but also within Judaism, as you see in the Old Testament, the festivals. There were extra Sabbaths, not just the Friday sundown to Saturday sundown. Those extra Sabbaths were never taken up by the Christian church, so that's why Paul in Colossians speaks about it, that don't let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink or with regard to religious festivals, new moon celebrations or Sabbath days. Those are a shadow of things to come. It's all the extra ones that he's referring to there. He's not talking about the 1 day principle of Sabbath. But interestingly, it's not just about people. Here in Exodus 20, he'll talk about all the different people. It'll talk about animals that work, also needing rest. But interestingly, in the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, about the land, caring for the environment, about stewardship of that environment, the soil. It needs rest, crops rotating and resting in order to have to maximize fruitfulness and fertility for growing the crops and the fruit. It's taken humans many more centuries to actually get it and have set aside policies. And of course, there's criticism some decades ago when that was coming in, that farmers were being paid to do nothing. An ignorance of what set aside was meant to be about for the good of our society, for producing food effectively and caring for that environment. Now we're a little better at thinking the environment matters. We've still not got there fully in our world. But a policy put in place in the European Union to reduce food surpluses, ironically, it wasn't done for environmental reasons initially, but it's there in the book of Leviticus, God commending we care for the environment and then the soil, giving the land its Sabbath. So what's the reason for Sabbath? It's to institute a work-rest balance to our lives. Surveys have shown at the end of the 20th century that people were working twice as much as they were at the beginning of the century. Because technology had enabled many things that you had to do manually, you could get it done quicker with all kinds of gadgets and equipment. But because you could get it done quicker, you actually packed more in. So you were still busy, you just did more things. And it was just assumed you would do all those extra things, and so you'd try and add a few more things in. But we need a work-rest balance. And it's not always easy to do that with the blurring of time and work schedules of working from home and so on. And even before the pandemic, there's a survey in London offices showing that people had less and less separate lunchtime. People were working, having their lunch at their desks or just working through, maybe hoping to leave a bit sooner, but maybe it didn't happen too often. But the reality was it wasn't making people happier. The sense of fulfillment was going down from the workplace. People may have had greater finances, but they weren't happier than their parents or grandparents at the same stage of life. God knew that that balance of work and rest was important for our sanity and our health. But to maximize the fulfillment of pleasure from our work, we're created to be workers, to be able to do things. But in order to enjoy that, we need to have a break from it, not be doing it all the time, and to do it for the good of others. We need a rest, a Sabbath, to mitigate the pressures of work. At times it can be overwhelming and challenging. Holidays, originally holy days, together with weekly Sabbaths, have a rest, an opportunity to relax, be refreshed and energized once more to continue our regular labors. So how should we use the Sabbath? Well, there is rest. Here, on it you shall not do work, you, your son, your daughter, your manservant or maidservant. Sadly, in the Victorian era, there were some employers, one famous one in Glasgow, who was very strongly about promoting the Sabbath, but made his workers work. So senior management had Sunday off, but not all the workers, which some people pointed out was a double standard. But it's also here for the animals that are working. Gnaw your animals. The righteous man cares for the needs of his animals, Proverbs 12:10. Interestingly, Britain was the first country in the 19th century, as I think I've mentioned before, with the law about the welfare of animals, setting up the RSPCA. That got through the House of Commons some years before we'd agree that we had to care for our children. Only in Britain could that happen, that animals are deemed the higher priority. But we understand. But it's God's concern for the well-being of all. He's not a killjoy. He's actually doing it that we might flourish for our good. So safeguarding time to rest, time to be with families, maybe making time to phone relatives who live at a distance or friends, time to have a walk in a park or the beach, time just to do something different as part of our schedule that's outside the rat race to recharge our batteries. And what's the purpose of that? Those words from Isaiah 58. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and doing as you please, if you call the Sabbath a delight, the Lord's day honorable, then you'll find your joy in the Lord. It's in order to bring joy. God's not doing it to be about rule keeping or time watching. It's to enable us to flourish, to give us joy and fulfillment. It's also a day for worship, to center our lives by beginning the week with God. The purpose why He created us, to live for Him, to honor Him. It's interesting in the retelling of the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy chapter 5. The reason for the Sabbath there is given us because the Lord brought you out of Egypt when you were slaves with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. It's about gratitude for the blessings of the past. Part of worship is saying thank you to God for past blessings. In the present, we can have struggles, difficulties, and we can be overwhelmed with the issues that we're facing just now. And it can take all the joy and pleasure out of life. But to be able to look back and say, God, thank you. Thank you so much for the blessings over the years. These things are precious. This day of worship, called the Lord's Day, is important, and Christians over the centuries have focused on that. John in Revelation 1, he's a prisoner in the slave gangs on the island. He couldn't gather with God's people, but he says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. He could still pray on his own. Yet in the New Testament we read, it was the day when they gathered to take up offerings in Corinth on the first day of the week, as Paul commended them. The church at Troas gathered weekly to observe communion. And Hebrews 4 reminds us there remains the Sabbath for the people of God, pointing forward to the ultimate rest in heaven. The writer of the Hebrews had to challenge some of his Italian readers not to give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. But lastly, it's a day for witness. A day for witness. I'll give an example to illustrate it. John, the Anglican evangelist, told the story of Gary Grant. Gary founded the Entertainer chain of shops, toy shops. There's one in the Wellgate. It was founded in the 80s. Gary was a workaholic, worked 7 days a week. and was exhausting himself and exhausting his staff. However, in 1991, he became a Christian and said, how can I live my faith in a way that affects my employees and my company, the ethos? Well, he took a policy. There'll be no opening on Sundays. His workers, every one of his workers will be guaranteed Sunday would be work-free. He's kept to that. There's been a cost. Some shopping centres wouldn't allow him to open shops there because it required 7-day opening. He said, I'd rather take the hit financially for the company. God will provide. They've continued. They're still going. I'm sure that, like other companies, there's been times of struggle. But the witness have been able to show that they could do their work, the company could make a profit and continue in business while having an appropriate balance of work and rest was really, really important. It was a good witness that his faith worked in practice in the tough world of business. For you and I, in the different worlds, the different experiences we have through the week, of having that balance of our lives to show how our faith works, can be a witness for Jesus Christ. So our questions for reflection as we draw this message to a close, that'll appear on our screen. How is my current work-life balance? Or do I safeguard adequate time for rest and for worship, and as a witness to my modelling of God's plan for each new week? Let's take a few moments to reflect on these questions before we come to communion.